Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity, the period of time that is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will take us to Barbaricum, or Scotland, as we call it today. We will learn about the Caledonians, the Picts, a few walls, and how it is that Rome never managed to conquer the Scots. We'll also spend a lot of time discussing historical evidence, our main source for historical evidence, and the importance of archaeology, as well as getting into a lot of what we frankly do not know. Our guide for this side quest is Dr. Andrew Tibbs, an archaeologist at Durham University. He is our first international guest on the podcast, and I'm excited to have him. Dr. Tibbs specializes in Roman Britain, particularly the Roman occupation of northern Britain and Scotland. I apologize for saying Roman Britain so many times, but I'm about to say it again. Dr. Tibbs has written several books about Roman Britain, including one on Hadrian's Wall, and he also runs the popular @RomanScotland account on Twitter. So, with the introductions out of the way, let's get into our next side quest. Dr. Andrew Tibbs, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. Very nice evening here in the UK.
Well, it's about 3 o'clock, a little after 3 here, and it should, if it stays like this, my son will be able to cut the grass, so it'll work out just perfectly, which would be nice. Before we get into the subject matter of today, could you tell us a little bit about your origin story? How did you end up doing what you're doing now? How did you get into the field of Roman history?
Yeah, so I grew up in a little village in Scotland, which was next to a hill which was alleged to be a Roman camp. And they used to find Roman coins and things there. And I think it really just triggered something in my subconscious. So I sort of moved away from that village when I was quite young. I really relocated to the northwest of England, to the Lake District. And when I was 14, I started being a volunteer excavator on a Mesolithic, a Stone Age cave site, and just sort of did that for 4 or 5 years. And then I went off and did a degree at university in a completely different area. And then probably about 15 years later, we had various things happened in my work, and I came home one day and said to my partner, I think now's the time to go off and do a PhD. So I went off and did a PhD in Roman archaeology with Durham University. But I've been doing archaeology for 25, 26 years, off and on. Some of that has been Roman sites. Some of it, as I say, is Mesolithic. Some of it's been industrial. But really my area of specialism is Northern Roman Britain. So North England, Hadrian's Wall, that sort of area, and Scotland. I specialize in most of Roman Scotland.
Well, let's talk about Roman Scotland a little bit. And we all remember from Roman history that the Romans never conquered Scotland. But can you tell us a little bit about who the natives were? Who were they? What were they called? And just give us a little 30,000-foot view of them.
Yeah, so Scotland's actually invaded by the Romans on at least 3 occasions, big scale. There's probably a few other incursions, but it's 3 of them are the main invasions. The first one happens around 77 AD. That's during the Flavian period. Scotland at that time doesn't exist. Scotland, as we recognize it today, doesn't really come into existence until about the 10th century. So this is all part of Britannia. The Romans would have called it Barbaricum, so sort of the land of the barbarians, sort of north of the empire. It was probably occupied by, well, it's very difficult to say because the Romans tell us there are lots of tribes in Scotland, but we only have the Romans to say that, and the Romans that write about that never even came to Britain. So we're just sort of, that's a word of mouth thing. In general, we refer to them as the Caledonii. That's what crops up in some of the texts, Roman texts that relate to the first century. The second, they sort of last until about 86, 90 AD. There's a very big battle called Mons Graupius, happens somewhere in northern Britain. We have no idea where. It could be a figment of the writer's imagination. But then the Romans withdraw. They briefly step into Scotland when Hadrian comes about. There's a further invasion after that under the Emperor Antonius Pius. That's quite a brief one. And then there's a third one which happens under Septimius Severus around about 208 AD. That lasts a couple of years. And that's a very different campaign. That's a very what we would describe today as genocide. There's problems with the tribes, and he's determined to wipe them out. Around about that time, we start getting another, probably what we'd call an ethnic group today, described as the Picts. That's roughly translated as the painted people. We know nothing about them. We've just got a Roman writer that sort of says Picts and Caledonii were invading the empire. We're very little, but they, we think, last well beyond the Roman period into 600, 700 AD. They do a lot of stone monuments later. It's all very vague, and as with anything, our history comes a lot from the Roman writers, and they're the ones that are quite biased because they are the winners, they're the ones that write history. So Rome Scotland's a very vague place.
So you mentioned that Septimius Severus invades and is going to plan a genocide, as was kind of the style at the time. Things were different. It was a very unusual time back in the 1950s. But I'm just curious. I have some vague memory that he kind of went up there because he needed a military victory. What are the reasons that he went up there? Was he sick of Rome? He just wanted to get back in the saddle and go to war, or what caused that to come about?
So with Septimius Severus, he was quite elderly and infirm, we're told, again by Roman writers who may be biased, but we're told that when he campaigns in Scotland, he's so ill that he gets carried around on a big sort of chair thing, big frame thing. We're also told that the tribes were being difficult and Rome was trying to sort of bribe them to behave, and they didn't behave. And Rome basically got fed up and decided they needed to come sort them out. The other side of the story is that he had his two sons, and they needed to be taken away from, I think it's described as the flesh pots of Rome. They needed to use a phrase I'm never a huge fan of these days, but to man up. They needed to experience war and a campaign, and they were taken there. And of course, Septimius Severus's campaigns stop all of a sudden about 211 AD because he drops dead, a place called York in the northeast of England. And then the sons basically run back to Rome and start fighting it out to become the dominant emperor, succeeding their father.
Oh, so he was the one who I checked that had told his sons to scorn all other men and basically mind the army, right?
Yeah, yeah. He's trying to. I think he's probably realizes he's coming to the end, and he's been involved in a lot of campaigns. And I think he realizes his sons may not have the military credentials that is needed for the empire. Of course, one of his sons is partly running the empire with him, but they haven't really got, I think, a lot of the military credentials that emperors are supposed to have. And we do see that at other periods. And if you're not deemed suitable for the imperial throne, you tend to get overthrown or murdered, and sometimes by the soldiers. So I think he's just sort of hedging his bets.
It's funny that you mentioned that they needed credentials, and I was thinking about what they would put on their resume. It's like, well, remember the time we murdered and genocided all the Scots? Clearly, we're suited to lead a multinational empire. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is, and you hit on this a little bit, what do we have as far as sources of information for I guess you would say, the formerly known as barbarians, now known as the Scots. Is it just Roman writers, other than archaeology, for the Scots themselves, or are there any written sources that we have from the Scots themselves?
No, it is mainly Roman writers. Some of them, I don't think any of them really are writing at the time of events. They all write sometime afterwards. The first century invasions, we know about those because they were written down by a guy called Tacitus, and he is the son-in-law of the military commander Agricola. He writes a book called the Agricola, and that details it all, but we think that was written after Agricola had died. And we're not sure if he's consulting Agricola or to other soldiers or he's secondhand. Other accounts are generally happening a bit later. And there's always, I mean, with the Romans, there's always a political bias. Why is someone writing? They're not really writing history books in the same way that we tried to do them, try to be a little less biased. They're always trying to win favor with people. And that's why the Agricola is written. It's not a historical account, it's a biographical account, but it's to position his father-in-law, Agricola, as being the great military commander that the emperor at the time was jealous of. So, in terms of sources from in Scotland, archaeology is the main source, or we have the books like the Agricola. Another one, the Scriptores Historia Augusta, gives a lot of accounts of different Romans, but it's written after most of those emperors have existed. But in terms of sources in Britain, they're not really coming around until you get historians like the Venerable Bede, Gildas. Gildas, I think, is writing late third, fourth century. So it must be into the fourth century. Yeah, so this is all, none of these are contemporary with what's happening. They're all looking back, and I think a lot of them are folk memories that are written down.
So, part of what I'm curious about is, to the extent we have good information on this, how the tribes, the various Scottish tribes, interacted with one another, whether they were unified or they were disorganized. And the reason I ask is to make a Simpsons reference. One of my favorite lines from groundskeeper Willie is, brothers, who's Scottish, brothers and sisters are natural enemies, like Englishmen and Scots, or Welshmen and Scots, or Japanese and Scots, or Scots and other Scots. Damn Scots, they ruined Scotland. Was it like that, or were they a unified group that worked together, or was it like the Germans, where the Romans would kind of play tribes apart, play them off against each other, off one another, and keep them separate?
To be very honest, we just don't know. The archaeological record sort of tells us a little bit of a story. There's a hill fort in near a place called Dunbar, sort of to the east of Edinburgh. There were some excavations there that were contemporary with some of the earlier Roman activity that found a hoard of bodies, mainly, I think, young men that had all been injured through swords and stuff. Now, we don't know who was doing that. Was it the Romans? Was it some sort of intertribal conflict? We don't know. The Romans tell us that they all banded together during the first invasion. All the indigenous tribes came together to fight the Romans, and of course the Romans say they were victorious. Like, it's something like 30,000 indigenous tribes people against a couple of thousand of Romans, and most of the tribes died, and two Romans cut their finger. There's really that sort of bias in it. I imagine what we do as archaeologists, and the tradition in North America is slightly different. You come at it from an anthropological point of view. You would be looking to how indigenous Aboriginal tribes behaved in North America before European settlers. And there are skirmishes and there are alliances. And I think we can apply that in Scotland, that there would be skirmishes, there would be alliances. We tend to think these days that a lot of tribal groupings are probably like large families, precursors to what we have today as clans. So it's probably going to be a mixed picture, but the archaeological record hasn't thrown up lots of evidence either way.
So let's talk a little bit about how, to the extent that we can, the tribes would interact with Romans, and we'll get into the walls here in a little bit. But was it an exchange, kind of like we've seen with the Germans, where the Germans knew of the Romans and they traded with the Romans and they got stuff from Rome and they went back and forth? Or did they keep separate? How did that cultural interaction work to the best that we can reconstruct it?
So we know we have an account. I think again it's the Scriptorius Historia Augusta that talks about when Claudius first invaded Britain. That was the first sort of proper invasion of Britain. It wasn't this sort of dipping toes in the water that Julius Caesar did. And we know that the king of the Orcades, which we assume to be the Orkneys, those islands up in the far north of Scotland, he travelled down to the Roman capital at that time, Camladunum, which is Colchester, which is just northeastish of London. He came down there to pay homage. So there certainly is interaction going on. We found bits of Roman pottery up again, Orkney, Shetland, those islands in the very far north of Scotland. So there is trade going on, and we know that happens in the empire. Before the army goes places, traders get there first and sort of build relations. Romans would have sent out diplomatic missions. We know they're doing this in southern England when they're starting to plan invasions and land in England. They build diplomatic relations, they bring gifts, and we have lots of Roman hoards of silverware across the north of Scotland beyond the general sort of Roman territories. So there's a lot of interaction in that sense. And for the Romans, the last thing they want to do is attack people because it's costly. You lose men, men go sick, men are killed, you have to retrain, you have to repair armor. If you're an army on the march, it's not quite so easy to start forging new weaponry and that. So they tend to be a lot more about diplomacy in the first place, and they do things like take slaves and hostages so that you would behave because your son was being educated in Rome. So they're sort of doing that other thing of you're trying to get the next generation embedded in Roman ways. So it's all very, they sort of try several different tactics. And by the time they get to Scotland, they become a lot more hostile. We think it's quite a violent and dangerous territory. We're told that by Roman writers. The archaeological evidence isn't strongly in favor of that, but that doesn't mean to say it didn't happen. But they're also using in Scotland a lot of psychological intimidation. They're sort of building massive fortifications that no one's ever seen before. They're building them in locations where people have to walk past them if they're moving through the landscape. So they're quite intimidating, but it's all very difficult to show in the archaeological record because we haven't done huge amounts of excavations of Roman sites.
So where geographically today, I guess we should kind of give the borders. Where geographically today would be the dividing line between what the Romans would call civilization, their country, and the barbarians, what they would call the Scots, and their lands and country. Where is that border roughly today?
Oh, it's a very movable feast, that, depending on the period and what's happening. So when the Romans invade England, they gradually move forward. They establish a limit, and I say limit because border means something in Roman language, and it means something different today. But essentially, the sort of edge of the empire was running across the north of England, and that evolved later into Hadrian's Wall. They come into Scotland the first century. They're occupying it, but it doesn't quite solidify into imperial territory. They go far up into Scotland, up towards Loch Ness, Inverness, up that way. That's where they campaign. That campaign is cancelled. They fall back to the north of England. They come back as far as sort of Glasgow and Edinburgh, so central Scotland, that very much. Southern central Scotland becomes part of the empire under Antoninus Pius. They may have gone slightly further. He dies. The line falls back to Hadrian's Wall. And then when Septimius Severus is the next person to come along, that's very much an invasion. So it's very much outside the empire and establishing a base and then going off and campaigning from those bases.
So you've mentioned that we probably a good time to get into that, the Hadrian Wall and the other walls that were created. But before we get into that and the Antonine Wall, I do want to ask you, because you kind of see this not too long after Augustus, I guess I'm trying to think of how to say it, doesn't officially kill off the Republic, but operates it pretty much in an elaborate sham or hoax, shall we say, while setting up the stage for ultimately what would become the empire. Is Rome kind of pumps the brakes on some of its territorial expansion, and it's not quite growing the way that it seemed to have always done so up until that time. And I'm just curious, what was it that made the Romans decide we're not going to keep pushing through Scotland? Was it that they didn't have like the tin supplies that England had, or was it just this group of people are just too difficult to conquer? I mean, do we have any idea why the Romans didn't keep pushing into Scotland?
Yeah, we do. Again, we've got the three invasions, and this is when they're properly in Scotland as a big force. The first century one, under Agricola, they get very far into Scotland, and the aim seems to be to put Scotland as part of the empire. And they're certainly building permanent fortifications, southern Scotland, central Scotland, and then they're building camps as they campaign, which will eventually be solidified into forts, and they would start to control most of the territory. That ends, we think, because there is trouble in Germany, and they have to start redeploying troops all across the empire. So we think troops in southern England are shipped over to Germany, which means there's a backfill that needs doing from troops further north in England. And Scotland just wasn't important enough for them to do that. Now, the texts we have tell us that it was because the emperor was jealous at how brilliant the general was, and he was recalled to Rome because the emperor was embarrassed and all that. But it seems to actually be more just readdressing, redeploying resources. They could have stayed if they wanted. They could have conquered, could have taken over. It wasn't that the people were troublesome. The Roman army had campaigned in much more diverse territories, the Sahara, the Alps. Scotland is nowhere on that sort of scale of things. The mountains are nowhere near as big or as hostile. The weather isn't as bad. They very much could have done it. The people, they'd faced a lot worse tribes. Yeah, they could have done it, but they just didn't have the resource. They were more important. It was more important to keep hold of the German frontier, because if that had fallen, you get lots of people from crossing Germany to get in. The second campaigns under Antoninus Pius, they build Hadrian's Wall, they move into Scotland, they build a new wall. We can come back to the reasons and all that. But essentially, that's the territory. They may be planning to take the rest of Scotland. It's never quite clear. But basically, Antoninus Pius dies, and they fall back to Hadrian's Wall. They start refurbishing some of the fortifications and seem to abandon most of those in Scotland. And then again, there's the third century Severan campaigns, and they end, as I said earlier, when Septimius Severus dies. And that's more about genocide rather than any sort of wanting to keep the territory. That's basically getting rid of a problem. But they never finished that campaign. So Scotland was very much, I think it was seen originally as another bit of territory to secure. Hadrian comes along and solidifies the borders of the empire, which means Scotland's generally left alone. Antoninus Pius, he wants to emulate Hadrian because he's another one of these emperors without military credentials. And he wants to copy what Hadrian did. Hadrian built a big wall across north of England. So Antoninus Pius thinks, well, I could build a wall across central Scotland, emulating Hadrian, but in a territory that's never been fully occupied. So there's a bit of prestige there for him.
Well, let's talk about those two walls a little bit. I'm sure that at least Hadrian's Wall is something that most people could say, oh, I've heard of that, even if they may not know what it is. Tell us, other than it being a wall, what it is, what its purpose was, and how it came to be.
Yeah, so Hadrian becomes emperor, I think around 117 AD. He's a military man. He's done a lot of campaigning. He's a very experienced general, and he decides to go on a tour of the empire around about I think 120 AD, and he starts noticing lots of problems with the soldiers. I think in Germany he noticed that they drink, gamble, and fraternize too much with women. And they're not really doing their job. And a military that is not doing its job and is somewhat bored becomes problematic because they start doing uprisings. He arrives in Britain around about 122 AD, and so we're told from Roman sources that he sees the army as doing bad things and decides that they're quite bored and they need to build this wall to keep the barbarians out of the empire. Now, looking at it from an archaeological perspective, we think Hadrian's Wall was built before 122 AD or started. Surveying, clearing landscape, uh, putting a basic infrastructure in to construct the wall. We think that was all probably happening around 120 AD under his governors. Hadrian's Wall itself is probably best to think of it as a complex. It's not one wall. It is a series of defenses focusing around a wall, and those are interspersed with military fortifications. So the wall itself has a ditch on the north side and it has a little slope. So if you're running at it, you've got to run up a slope, then you've got to go down several meters into a ditch, then back up again, and then attack the wall. It's really quite clever. On the south side of the wall, you've got a road, you've got a mound, then you've got a very wide ditch, then you've got another mound. So it's quite, that in itself is quite a complex thing. We're not quite sure why the southern side is so defensive orientated as the north side. There's lots of theories which I won't go into. And then you've got a series of forts. So every couple of Roman miles, you have a fort. This is all connected by the wall. And then in between the forts, you have smaller fortifications, mile castles, and then in between those, you have two towers. So it is a huge military structure. And I think the only thing we can really compare it to today is the Berlin Wall, which shared a number of similarities. Big wall, towers in between, checkpoints. There were checkpoints across Hadrian's Wall. And then on the western side, so Hadrian's Wall runs between a city called Newcastle and a city called Carlisle. Newcastle in the east, Carlisle in the west, and they're both at river mouths. And then on the western side from Carlisle, the defences of Hadrian's Wall, so not the wall, but a series of fortifications also run down the coast of a place called Cumbria. So that's possibly, if you ever see a map of Scotland in the southwest, it sort of overhangs England. And that's probably to stop anybody invading from that part of Scotland and sort of trying to circumvent Hadrian's Wall. So it is a complex military structure.
So was it always intended to be a permanent structure, or was it built on something else? I mean, what kind of supplies were used or materials were used when they started building the wall?
Yeah, so originally, just slightly south of Hadrian's Wall, before the wall was built, it was the northernmost sort of part of the empire, and there were a series of forts connected by a road. and that's called the Stane Gate, and that is the precursor of Hadrian's Wall. So they have the Stane Gate, do the first century invasions, Hadrian comes along, then they build a wall. It's the wall, I've sort of explained the technicalities of it, but even the structure itself is very complicated. So in the western sector, on the west side, it was originally constructed from blocks of turf. So big soil slabs is how they built it. The eastern side was stone. And then they changed it in the west, and they were building quite a wide wall. And then at some point, they've decided they didn't need it to be quite so wide, so they reduce it. So Hadrian's Wall in some places is actually three walls: the turf wall, the broad wall, the big wide one, and then the narrow wall. The structure itself seems to be built, in the most part, big stone blocks on the outside on a bed of clay. And then in the interior would have been rubble, river stone, things like that. Some sections are built on wetter ground, so there's sort of reed beds that they've built, and floating platforms that the wall's built on top of. So it is, considering this is 2,000 years ago, and all their surveying equipment was basically sticks and weights on the ends of string, and they've cleared some of the hardest rock we have in Britain is in sections of the wall. It's a fairly impressive engineering marvel on that.
How long did it take to complete the project once Hadrian said, "Go forth and build me this wall"?
Oh, we really don't know. There have been people who have attempted studies to sort of say it would take you, 2 weeks to build a couple of meters, because you've got to, once you have your infrastructure, your roads and camps where people live, then you've got your stonemasons chiseling the stone, transporting it to the site once you've surveyed it and cleared it. Some people have estimated, it would take, between, I think the estimates are something like 4 and 20 odd years. So we just don't know. We don't know how many people were involved in building it. There may have been slave labor involved. There may have been indigenous people brought in, maybe paid or enslaved to build it. We just don't know. Bearing in mind that none of the wall survives to its original height, it's very difficult to even estimate how big it was and how much stone would be needed.
Well, tell us about the Antonine Wall. Why did that wall get built, and who was behind the creation of that wall?
Yeah, so Emperor Hadrian dies 138 AD, and his successor is Antoninus Pius. He becomes emperor, but he hasn't got a military background. And, if the military and the empire don't think you're up to the job, they replace you. So he seems to decide that he wants to make his mark as a military man. And Hadrian is the emperor that everybody looks up to at that point. He is the big military expert. So Antoninus Pius decides he's going to copy what Hadrian did. So he's going to build another wall. It's going to stretch from the east of Scotland, in this case, to the west of Scotland. It's going to have those defences down the coast. It's going to be a series of forts interspersed with the mile castles, the smaller fortifications, and possibly the towers. And he decides it's going to be in Scotland because Scotland is that sort of unobtainable goal in the empire. No one has really entered Scotland and kept it for whatever reason. So he decides, if I'm going to Scotland and I can build a wall, I'll be as great as Hadrian, and I'll be better than Julius Caesar because I've conquered this bit of Britain that he never really conquered. And of course, Julius Caesar went around saying he had conquered Britain, and all he did was really step foot in Britain and then disappeared. So Antoninus Pius gets his men to go to Scotland, and they build a wall roughly between Edinburgh and Glasgow. So it is the central belt of Scotland. but it's built out of turf. So it's all these, it's like the turf wall of Hadrian's Wall. Um, it has a big ditch in the front, and then it has a big turf wall behind, possibly with a wooden walkway on top, we're not sure. But it only lasts, it's about 20, yeah, about 20 odd years we think it lasts. We know about 140 AD forts on Hadrian's Wall are being rebuilt. And we've got surviving inscriptions that says this bathhouse was rebuilt by whichever detachment of whichever legion. Um, and then it appears that as soon as he dies, they move back to Hadrian's Wall and decide they don't need Scotland.
And was that again just because the resources were needed elsewhere, or was there some attack? I mean, what was the motivation behind that?
We generally think is because the resources were needed elsewhere. There wasn't enough resource in southern Scotland to keep them there. Um, it's very much the Emperor's vanity project. So no one's daring to say this is a very silly idea. Why are you doing this and wasting all this resource? So I think as soon as he dies, they're like, nope, let's move back to Hadrian's Wall and really sort of have that as the line because it's a much better construction.
Well, and also I'm trying to remember, but it seemed like his successor Marcus Aurelius was constantly at war with either the Germans or to some extent the Persians. Were there troop movements that we're aware of that kind of coincide with, hey, this is great, really good job, but we need you over here now?
Yeah, I think there would have been redeployment because they were starting to have all the trouble in Germany, on the German frontier and elsewhere. And I suspect it was just a case of they pull the troops out of central southern England and redeploy them because they're better used elsewhere. Why keep Scotland? There's nothing there that is going to vastly improve the economy of the empire and is probably draining resources because they're having to occupy this other wall and some of the fortifications in between. So, and probably Hadrian's Wall still has a skeleton attached detachment along there. So, you save a lot of troops if you bring them back to Hadrian's Wall and rejig them, which is constantly happening. We don't necessarily have evidence from this period that that's what they did in Scotland, but it seems likely. It's sensible. I think quite often you can look at how a military behaves today, and there's so much, and even in Scotland in the 17th century, when the English Civil War is going on and Oliver Cromwell comes to Scotland, he follows a lot of the Roman places and has, fortifies them and has encampments in similar places. So I think you can look at armies and say, this is how they behave today or yesterday. Quite likely that happened 2,000 years ago.
It's funny that you mentioned Cromwell, and this is a little bit of a side quest, but I found out recently he's a cousin of mine. There's a
Wow.
there's a very when I visit England this summer, I'm not going to advertise that, but
No.
certainly wouldn't do it in Ireland either. But there is a very interesting story behind that. We don't have time for it here. Um, I do want to ask though, it sounds like maybe not from the way that you described this, but were the way you described, at least the way Hadrian's Wall was constructed, were these centers of cultural exchange, or was it just a sort of a demilitarized zone, like stay away? I mean, do we know if it operated as an exchange point?
It is really, that's a great question. It's really difficult to tell. We know there seems to be a big tribal movement to the northeast of Hadrian's Wall. They seem to come and settle near the wall, possibly for security and safety, and there would be some economic benefits. There certainly is trade going on. We have very limited evidence that there is interaction between people in some of the mile castles on Hadrian's Wall. So some of the finds we've found sort of imply that there may have been local interaction. We know there's farming taking place right on the north side of the wall, right up against the wall in certain places. Um, There was a study by a guy called Roger Mercer a couple of years ago. It looked at an indigenous site, a tribal site, in the western side to the north of the wall, about 20 miles north. And the Romans, there's evidence there was interaction with the Romans, that those tribal people were allowed to continue farming, which means that there would be benefits for the Romans. If you kill all your farmers, you've got no one to go to and get grain or horses and things like that. So it's in, you might not like it, but it's in everybody's interest that there is a symbiotic relationship. That, Romans are here to protect you if you're on their good side, but you're also producing goods and food for them. There was a study a few years ago, and I haven't looked at those figures myself, but it reckoned up to, I think, a couple of hundred square miles was needed around each fort to provide enough food for that fort. So even if those figures are slightly biased, you've got a long way to go to get enough supplies. And Hadrian's Wall was massive, and there were, lots of fortifications along that, and people would have needed feeding. So there would have been some sort of trading relationship, whether or not it's a fair trade. That's a completely different question. But I think there would have been a lot of interaction. There are gates through Hadrian's Wall. People would have passed through them, you know. So people are still migrating. People will still be trading. They can be taxed. Soldiers like a bit of tax. Although the downside of this is they can take whatever they want if they're passing through, whether that's your money, your animals, or your daughter. You're at the mercy of the Romans, and there's not much you can do against them.
Societal norms were very different back then. Uh, so the rules were different.
Well, I think you only have to look to today's war zones, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and there's a lot of similarities in the behaviors that we see reported about what's going on there. And I think for the indigenous people in Scotland, they're living in a war zone in that time. And I think you can look at broad similarities and see how people are treated, and that would have been the same here, regardless of, you know, you're either Roman or you're not Roman.
One thing that we like to think about ourselves because it makes us feel better is that we're somehow different fundamentally from people who lived thousands of years before us. But really, if you read enough history, it can be really depressing because people just at their core don't change. Maybe the methods change some, but a lot of the bad things that we read about today are not really that new. They're just new to us because we're experiencing them the first time.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. You look back to some of the studies done after the Second World War and why, Nazi Germany occurred, and why people went with it. And it's groupthink, as George Orwell would say, and that happened back then as well. Are you going to go up against? I mean, of course, a lot of the punishments, if you were a Roman soldier and you defied what you were ordered to do, the punishments could be quite brutal, including crucifixion and flaying, being whipped with whips with all sorts of things in them, and left out to, pinned to the ground, left out to die. That happens around that time. Thrown to the lions, of course, does happen in certain places. It's probably happening in these places as well. Maybe not lions, but you'd certainly be thrown to wild animals, I think, in some of the amphitheaters. But yeah, society changes in some ways and not other ways.
Well, on more cheerful notes, hopefully. Well, maybe not. We're going to talk about social media next. So, one of the Twitter accounts, I still call it Twitter, that you operate is Roman Scotland. Can you tell us how that account came to be and what you do there?
Yeah, so I've been running Roman Scotland now for, I can't remember how long, maybe 10 years, maybe a bit under 10 years. And it really came about because Twitter back then, some people may disagree, but I think back then it was a lot more of a melting pot of people you could interact with, and you see a lot of news and information and stories on Twitter, and I decided there was nothing happening about Roman Scotland. There was very, very few people or organizations tweeting on a regular basis. And because I've been studying it for many, many years, I have a huge collection. I've got 16,000 photographs of many, some interesting things and some random things. And I just thought it was a great way to engage with people. And I'd written, I think I started it just before I wrote my book, which was the first guidebook to Roman Scotland, that covered everywhere in Roman Scotland beyond the Empire. And I just wanted to engage with people and say, look, Scotland's got this massive, hugely important bit of history. A lot of our towns and villages have Roman origins here. Uh, and it's like I just wanted to tell people about it. So Twitter seemed back then the right place to do it. I think today there may be other platforms that I'd go to first, but I still have it. I still get a lot of followers, and I don't just tweet about Roman Scotland. I tweet about other parts of the empire, places I've been to, places that have got good photos and have a story about them.
So tell us where else we can keep up with you on social media. And also, if we want to understand more about Roman Scotland, where should we look?
Um, I think Twitter is the first place I really do a lot of stuff. I think I have an account on most social media platforms as Roman Scotland, all one word on most of them. One or two might be an underscore. Uh, I don't post on those too much, but if Twitter goes the way it may go in the next year or two, I shall migrate to one of those. I also do books. I do a lot of writing of books, and in the UK, I appear in the media here and there, uh, doing various things. Usually, if you do a search for Andrew Tibbs Roman Scotland, you'll find something I've done. Um, Books I just published. Um, The Final Frontier, which is a book about Scotland's early Roman landscape. That is published by a house called Amberley. I've also just about to publish, I think next week, mid-May, a short guide to Roman London. So it's one of the first sort of fully comprehensive guidebooks on Roman Scotland, Roman London, which has a lot of the sites, tells you where you can see Roman things. It also tells you what's beneath the ground that we know is there, that you might not be able to see many remains. And there's a few sort of hidden curiosities around London that are featured in that book. Um, and my first book, Beyond the Empire, Guide to Roman Scotland, is now out of print, but it should be out again at the end of 2024. And all of these are available on Amazon in America, possibly through the publisher. I'm not entirely sure. And I think bigger bookstores, Barnes and Noble, and that can get them in for people if they really want to read about it.
And what's the name of the one coming out on Roman London, since it may come out in time for my trip?
It is a short guide to Roman London.
All right. We'll keep an eye on that one and the publishing date, see what we can make happen. Tell us, though, a little bit, if we were going to go back to the primary sources, what would be the best Roman primary reading materials about Roman Scotland?
So the main one that actually has a decent length, because a lot of them are just little excerpts here and there, little sort of people talking about Roman activities in the briefing mentioned Scotland. But the best one is the Agricola and the Germanica. That's the full title. It's sometimes published as the Agricola, and that's by Tacitus. It is available, I think, out there. There have been translations out there since the 17th century, I think, but most of them are available on online. You can download them for free and get them as ebooks. The main translations, I think, are generally all based off of each other. But I do always say to people, it's not a historical account, it's a biographical propaganda account. So even though it tells you what the Romans say is going on in Scotland. The archaeology doesn't always match it, and it is written, to play up the person in charge. I always say to people, the book mentions that Agricola, who's the general, personally oversaw the construction of military camps during his campaign. That's probably rubbish because they have whole detachments of engineers and people to clear things and people to build things, and he's meant to be off campaigning and being all important. So I don't think he was stood watching everything that was going on. That's just something that's put in to make him out to be better than he was.
Well, I mean, you got to have a good press man, someone out there, talking about
Who
how
better
great
than
you
your
are.
son-in-law?
Right. Well, I mean, the guy may have had a very large estate that the son-in-law wanted to inherit. He's got to earn that. That's not easy.
I think
Uh,
he's done very well.
yeah, he probably did get the bragging rights amongst the family for pumping him up there. It was, it's memorable. It's still how many thousands of years later, and we're still talking about it. So
We
it's
are.
impressive.
No. And it has been hugely influential in understanding archaeology in the Roman period in Scotland. Sometimes a little too influential, but it's a hugely important volume. It's one of the only detailed, loosely detailed accounts of campaigning in the Roman world. That is written within living memory of that battle. There's very few of them out there, and this is one of the most important.
I'm looking here because I think I got. Give me 1 second. I think I got one of Tacitus's books up there. Yep, I have the Annals up there. And I mean, he was a very prominent historian, one of the major ones that we have and rely on. But you've hit this a little bit, so I feel like I should ask you about it. The problems with the primary sources, the high points. What are the major things you have to look out for when you're reading those, other than the bias that you've already mentioned?
Well, I mean, the bias is the big thing in it because he bigs them up. So he says that he personally oversaw all this construction, which is very, very unlikely. It talks about Mons Graupius, the big battle at the end. It over exaggerates the numbers. Um, I think some like 6 or 8 pages are taken up with one of the speeches of the indigenous tribes person. Of course, that's complete fabrication, and there have been analysis of the writing style by two guys called Woodman and Krause. They did a very good analysis of it. One of the other issues we have is that we don't actually know where any of this is taking place. Um, there's no there's the names of two inlets, river inlets, estuaries really. They're mentioned, the Badotra and the Clota, and we assume that they refer to the Forth, which is near Edinburgh, and the Clyde, which is near Glasgow, but they equally could apply to inlets further south. It's just that people have chosen to understand it all in a certain way, and sometimes the archaeology doesn't marry up with that. So even our dating of sites in Scotland that a lot of the time we assume are first century, that's on a very, it's not on the firmest foothold in the world. A lot of it is educated guesses, but the Agricolas just led to a lot of this sort of a bit of an artificial framework being placed on Scotland that we're only now at the 21st century starting to unpick some of that.
Well, you mentioned the factual inaccuracies, but you should never let the facts get in the way of a good story sometimes. As we learned from the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And, you got to sell copies of the books, you got to make a living.
Well, it's all about currying favor with the imperial court at the time when Tacitus is writing, because you don't want to cheese them off, otherwise, someone comes for you. Emperors are very Yeah, very they sway in the wind quite easily.
Yeah, I think it was Claudius who wrote a very accurate history of his family's rise to imperial heights. And funny, we don't have that book anymore, right? It's, it's gone.
I know it seems to be something that leaders of nations tend to do.
Well, yeah, it you got to protect your reputation, I guess. One question I have for you. Last thing I do want to ask you, and thank you very much for coming on and taking the time. This has been very educational. But what is a future topic you would like to see me try to find someone come on and talk about that you'd like to hear us cover on the podcast?
Oh wow, there's so many. Oh goodness. Uh Blimey, there's like hundreds of thousands of things. I think you could get someone on that talks more about some of the practical work that's been going on Hadrian's Wall. Um, there's I can give you names at some point, but there's
That would be helpful.
Vindolanda, which is one of the Roman forts in Hadrian's Wall that has been excavated every year, bar I think one in the pandemic, for about 55 years now. They do some amazing work at the moment. Anybody can volunteer to go on their excavations, and they're digging through the fort. They found something like 7 different forts on the one site. So, and that's been excavated by the same family for 50, 60 years. So Andrew Burley does that. Um, there's a guy called Rob Collins at Newcastle University whose expertise is largely Hadrian's Wall. He does some amazing work. Rob is very good. There's a guy, I'll say the names, David Walsh, who I think is now at Newcastle University, has done a fascinating book on the Mithras, the cult of Mithras, Mithraic temples, which is a military religion that's founded in the East, and they do all sorts of interesting ceremonies underground and worshipping the sun and worshipping bulls. But David's really good on that sort of stuff. Um, there's some excavations a colleague of mine has been involved in a place called Norton Disney down near Lincoln. She's been doing excavations there. That might be an interesting one for you. Who else have we got doing stuff? I have a colleague who's about to publish a book. He's writing it at the moment on following the journey of Agricola through Scotland's landscape. So he's sort of following literally in the footsteps of Agricola, who does that first invasion of Scotland. Alan Montgomery, lovely guy. I was speaking to him last week about it. My friend Claire Millington, she's in UCL, London, University College of London, is about to do a book on Roman objects and the impact on families, what we can tell from families living on military sites and being around them. So there's a handful of people that might be able to give you something really good on Roman Britain. Another colleague of mine, Stephanie Hoss, who is at the University of Cologne, she works in various areas, but Roman toilets was an area she was quite an expert on, and the things you can tell from Roman toilets about Romans.
Interesting. All right. That's not one I would have thought of. So that might be that
We
one
might
and
not talk
the
about that sort of thing anymore, but it always sticks in my mind that
right,
she's big on
right,
latrines,
right.
Stephanie.
That one and the cult of Mithras, I might definitely have to reach out on, um, and see what we can make happen in the future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. And Dr. Tibbs, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun and very informative. And people call 540-632-0160, ask a question and leave a voicemail, do whatever you want. We'll get you on the podcast. And remember, folks, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.